Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fifth Wildlife and Wind Energy webinar series. My name is Joy Page, and I am the Director of Renewable Energy and Wildlife at Defenders of Wildlife. And we are so excited to welcome you all to the fifth webinar in our 9-webinar series. And this one will be on eagles, permitting process, and best practices for monitoring and mitigation. All right, but before we begin, as always, we're going to start with some housekeeping. You will be muted throughout the webinar, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. So if you are having, if you have questions, please feel free to use the questions feature throughout. If you are having audio issues, we recommend that you try dialing in. That usually resolves it. Also, we have to give our legal disclaimer that the National Renewable Energy Laboratory is a policy-neutral organization, as you all know, and any views and opinions expressed in this series are those of the speakers and do not reflect the views or position of NREL or the Department of Energy. And on that note, we'd also like you all to assume positive intent. We're bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders, and that's why we're really excited about this webinar series, and it's great to hear this diverse views. As I said, you will be muted, but we really do want you to engage throughout. Please ask questions, and we will have some fun panels. Also, to ensure everyone can easily participate, if there is a technical issue you don't understand or an acronym, feel free to use that question box and folks will help you. We're going to do our best to avoid acronyms. And as I mentioned, please ask questions throughout. The great news is we are recording this webinar series and it will be up on Tethys as well as a Q&A doc. So be patient with us as we get those loaded, but this is where you'll be able to look and find that information. As I've mentioned, this is a 9-part webinar series. After today, we will be more than halfway done. We have webinar 6 that we're about to schedule. It will be before webinar 7, which is scheduled for October 22nd. And then we'll have webinar 8 and webinar 9 in November. So now we are really excited to get to this incredible panel of speakers talking about eagles and the permitting process. We're going to start with Brooke Marcus Wahlberg, who's a partner at Nasseman. Brooke is an incredible lawyer who's been working on these issues for quite some time, and she's always the attorney that I go to when I have legal questions. And she's also a co-partner in my first podcast from ELI, so you'll have to check that out if interested in learning more about eagles after this. Brooke will then turn it over to Dr. Chris Farmer, who has spent more than 20 years working on ecology issues, and a substantial part of that time working in consulting on issues such as eagles and wind energy. And he's going to geek out for us and talk about the consulting process. Then he's going to turn it over to Dr. Laura Nagy, who's the Director of Permitting and Environmental and Avangrid Renewables. Dr. Nagy also spent time working on Eagle Consulting and now is in it at Avangrid. So she can really give us the full industry perspective on the Eagle permitting process. What you'll probably notice missing is a regulator. We were really hoping to have Scott Carlton on the line. He is the Chief of the Migratory Bird Division at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Region 2. Unfortunately, he was forced to cancel last minute yesterday, and he will not be with us. But we're going to have plenty of time, this means, to answer questions and talk more about the permitting process. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brooke.
Hey everyone, let me see if I can get this started right. Here we go. Thank you so much for having me. I really did enjoy our podcast experience, Joy. That was a lot of fun, and I'm excited to be here today, so thanks again. So today I'm going to set the stage with the regulatory framework. There's a lot going on about the Eagle Rule. There's been a lot of history, in particular the last 10 years, and so I'm going to give a brief description of what's been going on there and then keep going into the weeds from there. So we're going to start pretty general with a historical timeline going to move into details. It's going to be a lot of info. For those of you that aren't as familiar with the Eagle Permit Program, some of it may be a bit confusing at first, but as we get into more detail, and I think as we get into Chris and Laura's portions, some of the details that I'm laying as a foundation now will start to coalesce in a way that makes a bit more sense. So bear with me as I get through this stuff. We'll get into the weeds a little bit, and then we'll get to see a more practical implication as we go on. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of the incidental take permit program. And I should warn you, I am terrible at loading up my slides with text. I think this is the most text-heavy slide I have. But essentially, it is the history of the regulatory events and some non-regulatory events associated with the incidental take permit program. So starting in 1940, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act was enacted. It was enacted to protect the bald eagle, the symbol of our nation. But they included golden eagles because juvenile bald eagles look a lot like golden eagles. And then to ensure that all ages of bald eagles were protected, they threw in golden eagles and ensured that they were protected as well. That authorization, unlike the Endangered Species Act, the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act doesn't have a permit or authorization concept built into the statute itself. We'll talk here in a second about how it authorizes the Fish and Wildlife Service to go establish a permit framework, but that isn't really built into the statute itself in the same way it is in the Endangered Species Act. When the Endangered Species Act was enacted, the bald eagle was one of the originally listed species, and so the bald eagle enjoyed the protections of the Endangered Species Act for many decades, until 2007, when the service delisted the bald eagle from the Endangered Species Act. The bald eagle had suffered from exposure, DDT, thinning eggshells, all sorts of things. And when DDT was outlawed, the populations began to rebound. And by 2007, that's when the service determined that the bald eagle met the delisting factors under the Endangered Species Act. So in 2007, the bald eagle no longer had protections under the Endangered Species Act. There were still anticipated impacts to bald eagles that would be prohibited by the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. And in response to that, as a stopgap measure, the Fish and Wildlife Service issued its National Bald Eagle Management Guidance. That guidance sets forth best management practices and guidance really related to nest visibility, how much action can be done within, how close to a nest during what time of year, that sort of thing. But in 2009, the Fish and Wildlife Service issued the Eagle Rule, and that really provided the permitting scheme for incidental take of eagles. So I'm going to use the term incidental take quite a bit. For those of you unfamiliar with that term, there's take that's purposeful. You go out and you hunt something or you kill it. And there's incidental take, which is take that occurs while you're doing something else. And so that can be a collision with a power line. It can be a collision with a wind energy turbine. It could be a collision with a train, but all of those are examples of non-purposeful take where the take occurs incidental to doing something else. And we'll talk a little bit more about take in the context of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act here in a second. So in 2009, we saw our first Eagle Rule providing a permit scheme. Around that time is when the wind energy industry was really taking off, and concerns and knowledge about wildlife impacts were really starting to be made known. And eagles became a topic of focus for both the wind energy industry and NGO stakeholders alike. And realizing that the wind energy industry was perhaps going to be using this permitting program more than initially had been planned when it was promulgated in 2009, the service issued the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance module for the wind industry. Now, the plan has always been, and I think it still remains, though I'm not sure what the timing is of that, to issue other modules for other industries. But the first one out of the box, and the only one that exists to date, is for the wind industry. In 2009, that Eagle Rule only provided for incidental take permits that had a max term of 5 years. A lot of the projects that were considering obtaining regulatory assurances to guard against violations of the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act actually had systems that were in place or projects in place that went much longer than 5 years. And so there was a desire to actually make permits fit the projects that they would be authorizing. And so that would be, so there was an amendment in 2013 to amend the Eagle Rule to extend the maximum permit term for programmatic Eagle take permits, which are incidental take permits, to 30 years. That extension was challenged, and it was successful in court. The North District of California invalidated that permit extension, the 10-year rule, on NEPA grounds in 2015. So from 2009 to 2016, the maximum permit term was only 5 years. In 2016, the Fish and Wildlife Service came back out with an amendment to the Eagle Rule. With those amendments, they made several amendments that we're going to talk about here, but it also included an amendment back to extend the permit term to 30 years, and that's still in place today. As we'll talk about here in a bit, the permit process isn't easy. There's a lot of things that go into applying for an Eagle permit. There's many components, and these permits are taking time. In an attempt to respond to this, the service hosted a webinar in December of 2018 that suggested a low-risk permit framework. So far, it's only been in webinar form. It hasn't been proposed. It's not finalized. It's unclear whether it ever will be. But essentially, it provided a way for a streamlined permit process where projects seeking take authorization for wind energy that fell into certain low-risk areas for both Eagle species could pursue the streamlined option. Again, that option has not manifested into a proposed rule or a final rule. It may never, but these are the sorts of things that have been going on as this Eagle permit program gets its legs under it. Last year, the service also approved a power pole retrofit in lieu fee program. We'll talk about this in a little bit, but the only readily accessible compensatory mitigation option for Eagle take permits, for incidental take permits, is power pole retrofit. That means that an applicant needs to identify someone who can provide power poles that can be retrofitted to Eagle safe. To try to streamline that process, the service approved an in lieu fee program where essentially the in lieu fee program operator serves as a, for lack of a better term, power pole broker, where they find companies that have power poles. They've done the kind of template agreements and frameworks that the service wants to see to implement that. And then when an applicant needs poles, they can go to this program and identify those poles. I think we'll get into it a little bit later. It's that the power pole retrofit concept is fairly challenging in practice and can cause delays and is fairly complex to implement in practical real life terms. The other thing I wanted to mention is that a group called the Energy and Wildlife Action Coalition had sued the service, challenging the 2009 Eagle Rule for being beyond its authority as set forth in the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. That litigation was stayed when the 2016 amendments came out, and then just last year, the service reached settlement with the Energy and Wildlife Action Coalition. And the result of that settlement is that the service will propose an amendment to the Eagle Rule by August of 2021, and then finalize any amendment by August of 2022. So in the next couple of years, we may see additional amendments beyond the ones that we already saw in 2016. Okay, so that was the history of what's been going on. Let's talk a little bit about what guidance is out there that can help process these incidental take permits. I already mentioned the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance. Again, that's specific to the wind energy industry. It includes a collision risk model that the purpose of which is to predict take that may arise from operation of a wind energy facility. It also includes a power pole retrofit resource equivalency analysis. You'll see later, I know Joy said to stay away from acronyms, but REA, you'll see REA, is a resource equivalency analysis that essentially says, okay, I've got a take prediction of so many eagles, how many power poles do I need to retrofit to meet my compensatory mitigation requirements under the rule? So both that collision risk model and resource equivalency analysis were originally set forth in that Eagle Conservation Plan guidance. Additionally, Legacy Region 6, which is the Mountain Prairie region, has a number of guidance documents related to eagles and some specific to wind energy and eagles and eagle permits. And so two of those are listed here. Those have been out for a few years, but just this past year they were updated. And so that's another resource, particularly for that region. If someone is seeking an eagle permit in that region, then there's this guidance that's the region wants to see followed when you're applying for a permit there. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act generally. I talked about how the statute itself provides authorization for a permit program, but doesn't really provide authorization. It doesn't provide the permit program itself. So the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act is found at 16 U.S.C. 668A. And I won't read to you the big paragraph of text. And on my computer, I think the slides are lagging, but you'll see it here. This is the language that's in the statute that says, hey, Secretary of the Interior and truly the Fish and Wildlife Service who administers this program, you can authorize the taking of eagles pursuant to regulations as long as you are consistent with this authorization. And so here you talk about a few things. You see the preservation of bald or golden eagle to permit the taking of scientific or exhibition purposes, scientific societies, zoological parks, religious or purposes of Indian tribes. Or you see that there's a clause for permitting take that's necessary to permit the taking of such eagles or other interests in a particular locality. So this is really where the service finds its authorization to have set up the eagle rule. And that's where you see some of the threshold standards keyed to is this authorizing provision right here. So I mentioned take earlier. We've talked about incidental take that isn't deliberate, it's non-purposeful, you're doing something else when take occurs. Well, for those of you that are unfamiliar with the concept of take is truly death or injury of a protected species, and each of the federal wildlife laws have a different definition of take. So the Migratory Bird Treaty Act definition differs a little bit from the Endangered Species Act provision, which differs a little bit from the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act definition. But at the crux of it is death or injury. The take prohibition for the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act includes this term disturb. And disturb is further defined in rules to mean to agitate or bother either species of eagle to a degree that causes or is likely to cause injury, decrease in productivity by substantially interfering with normal breeding, feeding or sheltering, or nest abandonment by substantially interfering with the same. So it's very similar to the Endangered Species Act harm definition, but not quite the same. Okay, so in that authorization provision, we talked about different types of permits that were contemplated in that authorization. Well, the service did use its authority under the GEPA to promulgate rules for permits for other causes. And so you have your scientific and exhibition, religious, depredation, golden eagle nest removal. You have your incidental take, disturbance, which we just talked about the definition of disturb, and nest removal. And all of those are found in 50 CFR Part 22. For purposes of what we're focused on today, we're really looking at that incidental take. In the 2009 rule, it was called programmatic take, and we'll talk about that briefly here in a second. But when you see programmatic take or incidental take in the context of eagles, that's really talking about 50 CFR Part 22.26. So that's really the regulation we're focused on. Okay, so in 2016, there were amendments to 22.26. And here I'm just going to go over some of the major changes because there are some things like the name of the permit and those sorts of things that I want to touch on briefly here before we get into the basic requirements. So in 2009, incidental take permits were known as programmatic eagle take permits. And some of that was to capture the concept of ongoing take that may occur over time. And some of it was just to avoid having a duplicative permit name with the Endangered Species Act, who also has an incidental take permit. Over time, I think the service decided that the use of the same term, incidental take permits, was more straightforward and easier to use than programmatic eagle take permits. So 2016 rule now speaks to incidental take permits, which is how we'll refer to them. Excuse me. In 2009, the threshold standard to obtain an eagle permit required that the applicant to demonstrate that take was unavoidable even with the implementation of advanced conservation practices. There have been no formally approved advanced conservation practices. Most of them are minimization measures that folks are applying to determine their effectiveness on eagles. And so that was a hard threshold to apply. One of the strongest things a rule can do is provide a bright line threshold in which to apply a rule. And I think feedback over that threshold over time caused the service to amend the rule in 2016. And instead, the applicant must demonstrate that the take cannot be practicably avoided. And we'll look at the definition of practicable here in a second. Another major change that happened in 2016 is that the service moved from looking at populations within bird conservation regions, which were loosely based on service regions, to looking at the major eagle flyways. These are called eagle management units and really align with the major north-south flyways throughout the United States. The other thing that the service did is introduce the local area population into the rule itself. So local area population, and Chris and Laura can talk about this much better than me, but it's essentially a circle drawn around a project that relates to the natal dispersal distance of a species. And so the bald eagle has a different size circle than the golden eagle. But essentially what that does is draw that circle around your project, look at what kind of take is happening within that circle, whether authorized through a permit or unauthorized based on service enforcement actions. Look at the type of take that you're applying for and how much take you're applying for, and compare all that. And if you hit certain thresholds within that local area circle, then it may actually impact your ability to get a permit. It may require more NEPA, and in the case of bald eagles, it may require that you provide mitigation. The local area population is a concept that had been in the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance. It had been in consideration for the NEPA analysis for these rulemakings, but it had never been codified as a part of the rule since 2009. But in 2016, it made it into the rule as part of the preservation standard. So let's talk about the preservation standard. As you saw in the authorization in BGEPA 668A, it says, if after determining it's compatible with the preservation of bald and golden eagles, and then it talked about all of the scientific, zoological, those types of permits, and said, or you can also issue permits necessary for another locality. The service sees that compatible with the preservation of bald and golden eagles as the defining standard that it must apply when determining whether someone can obtain an incidental take permit. And the way that preservation standard is defined in rule is to be consistent with the goals of maintaining stable or increasing breeding populations in all eagle management units and persistence throughout the local area populations. So before issuing an eagle take permit, the service is going to look at the impacts of the take that's requested in both the larger flyways, but also the local area population, and to determine whether or not they're meeting that preservation standard. We've talked about practicable. So practicable is defined to mean available and capable of being done after existing technology, logistics, and costs, in light of a mitigation measure's value to eagles and the activity's overall purpose, scope, and scale. So providing a little bit more direction there on what might be practicable. The other term I wanted to touch on now is additional. The rule requires that any compensatory mitigation be additional. And what additional means is that the benefits of a measure improve upon the baseline in a way that's new and would not have occurred without the required compensatory mitigation measure. So if you're thinking of power pole retrofits as the primary compensatory mitigation available right now, many transmission and distribution line providers have their own avian protection program that sets forth a power pole retrofit program. And so in those cases, there's a lot of poles that have already been marked for retrofitting by virtue of that company's policy. What this additional is saying is that for mitigation to really count for your impacts for eagles, you have to find poles that wouldn't have already been a part of someone else's program already. I mean, I think as we'll get into later, that can be challenging because there's a finite number of poles out there, right? So determining, which ones are already covered, which ones may be new, and working all of that out between the power pole provider, the applicant, and the service is something that takes time and is proven to be relatively complex. Let's talk a little bit about the basics. And by basics here, I mean, these are the issuance criteria within 22.26 that direct the service what to look at when an applicant is submitting an application for an incidental take permit. First is a basic level that take must be compatible with the preservation standards. So that means with the EMUs and the LAP, the Eagle Management Units, and the local area population, they have to make those findings. The taking is necessary to protect an interest in a particular locality. That's truly the incidental take authorization from that provision within the rule. Okay, the taking must be incidental. Again, it's something that happens incidental to other activity. These incidental take permits are not authorizing activities directed at eagles. Again, an applicant must propose all avoidance and minimization measures to reduce takes to the maximum degree practicable relative to the magnitude of the impacts to eagles. So here you have that practicable definition coming into play, and you also have a consideration about the actual impacts to eagles that are being proposed by a particular applicant. We'll talk more about compensatory mitigation, but an applicant must show they have provided all their appropriate and practical compensatory mitigation when required, which is different for bald eagles than it is for golden eagles. But there aren't higher priority interests that will not be precluded from obtaining a permit. So here, this is ensuring that for religious purposes or whatnot, that the take that's applied for a particular activity isn't maxing out that local area population or eagle management unit in a way that the service would be kept from issuing a permit to other priority interests, such as religious use. The other thing is that the service must ensure that the permit issuance will not interfere with ongoing civil and criminal enforcement actions. If you've had an eagle take before you get a permit and the service took enforcement action against that, looking at that to make sure that they won't be interfered with. And then finally, there's a permit fee of $36,000 for an incidental take permit. I'm going to go over a few more. I've already beat this one into the ground, but the preservation standard assessment requires that you look at both eagle management units and local area populations. And again, an important thing I think to remember about the eagle rule, and this is really going to come into play when you're hearing about some of the components that Laura and Chris talk about, is that the rule says that where the service has officially issued or endorsed through rulemaking procedures, which is really notice and comment is what that's getting at, protocols for a given activity, then an applicant for an eagle take permit must use those protocols unless the service waives. And this standard, it applies to survey protocols, modeling protocols, monitoring. And so it's important to understand that while you have the rule that prescribes how you need to do things, there's also requirements within the rule that says if there's another set of protocols or guidance that's gone through notice and comment and approved by the service, you have to use that methodology. And so there we come back to that power pole retrofit RIA that I was talking about earlier. That RIA is a approved service protocol for counting how many eagles and poles match up. That's gone through notice and comment back when the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance went through. And similar, the service has prescribed approaches for take estimates. That's the collision risk model. Again, that's something that's gone through notice and comment, and the service has approved it. So a wind energy applicant applying for an eagle take permit is required to use the collision risk model for estimating take unless the service chooses to waive it. So that aspect of the rule I think is important because you see different pieces of guidance and understanding how those actually fit into the eagle permit application process. That's where it fits in. Okay, so I think next we're going to talk about mitigation. So I've alluded to mitigation. We've talked a little bit about power pole retrofits already. Mitigation requirements are different for golden eagles than they are for bald eagles. When assessing eagle populations, the service determined that within the EMUs, golden eagles can't sustain additional take without compensatory mitigation. And so under their preservation standard or their interpretation of it, they're requiring a 1.2 to 1 ratio for take of golden eagles. So if you take one golden eagle, you must provide the equivalent of 1.2 eagles worth of power poles, essentially is the easiest way to think about it, to offset your one eagle. For bald eagles, populations are doing well, which is great. And so within the EMUs, they're generally not requiring compensatory mitigation because bald eagles can sustain take within their EMUs. And so what they did in the 2016 rule and the accompanying NEPA document and population report is they set some EMU thresholds for each of the EMUs that said, okay, well, if we ever reach a point where bald eagle take is at a threshold that exceeds these EMU thresholds, then mitigation is going to be required for any permit. They also said that where you are exceeding certain thresholds within that local area population, the service has the discretion to require compensatory mitigation because you've either exceeded 5% of the authorized take within that circle. So what that means is you've got your project, you have a circle, you're applying for a certain amount of take. They look within that circle for all the other authorized take plus your take. And if that number together exceeds 5% of the eagles that are in that circle, then the service may require mitigation for bald eagles. And similarly, if you're looking at that circle and they are aware of unauthorized take that's occurring in that local area, it could be from poaching, it could be from reported fatalities, that sort of thing. And if that exceeds 10% of that local area population, then that too can be a trigger for compensatory mitigation for bald eagles. And again, we talked about the term additional. Mitigation must be additional and maintained for the duration of the permit term and include adaptive management mechanisms to ensure that that mitigation stays in place or retains its value over time. All right, and just a couple more things here. You know, we talked about how the 2009 Eagle Rule only provided for 5-year permit terms, and there were many folks that were advocating for longer term permits to actually match up with project lifespans. And so now incidental take permits can be up to 30 years. But alongside that extension of the permit term, the 2016 rule also provided extra requirements for permits that exceed 5 years. So if you have a permit that's longer than 5 years, you have these extra requirements. You must conduct monitoring by independent third parties that report directly to the service. An adaptive management approach must be provided, and you must have permit reviews with the service at least every 5 years. And so the 5-year review is something that I think you're going to hear more about a little bit later. In practice, we haven't had a 5-year review yet, right? The rules, the 2016 amendments requiring 5-year reviews was finalized on December 16th, 2016. So that means if you got a permit December 17th, 2016 under the new rule, which for reasons we'll talk about isn't the case, these permits take time. The first opportunity for a 5-year review wouldn't arise until December 17th, 2022. And actually, I think the effective date of the 2016 rule wasn't until January. So say January 2022 is the first opportunity anyone has to actually conduct one of these 5-year reviews under the 2016 amendment. But what it says is that during these 5-year reviews, if your estimated take levels exceed predicted 5-year projections, then permit terms are subject to change. If your estimated take levels are below predicted 5-year projections, then downward mitigation adjustments can be made. And what that means is, we'll hear about this a little bit more, the collision risk model tends to over-predict or overestimate the take that's going to occur at a given project. And so originally, those mitigation numbers are keyed towards take predictions that are probably higher than what's actually going to happen within a project. And so if after 5 years, in fact, that shows to be true, yeah, it was an overestimate, then any mitigation you've provided that's over what actually happened in that 5 years can be credited towards your next 5-year term. So that's what that means there. Other changes to the permit where you're below your take limits can be made with the permittee's consent. So the service and permittee sit down every 5 years. They look at what actual take happened. They look at whether it's above or below projections, where it is in response to the permit take limit, and then whether or not and what kind of changes can be made, have varying levels of permittee involvement. But truly, the one that can be made without any consultation of the permittee is where you're below your take estimate. The service can credit you back mitigation for your following permit term. And another thing to note is that these 5-year reviews aren't free. Each one has an $8,000 fee. So what's up next for incidental take permits? So there's a lot going on right now that we may or may not see depending on how things progress. There is an updated collision risk model that's been out for notice and comment twice that we hear will be finalized any day now. There's also been some monitoring guidance specific to the wind energy industry that speaks to how you monitor for compliance with your permit. Supposedly, that's been in development for years, or at least a while now, and we keep hearing it will be out for notice and comment, or that we'll see it one way or another, but when and what that will look like, I think for most is still a mystery. I talked about the Eagle Conservation Plan guidance being a module directed at the wind industry, but that other modules were contemplated. it's been rumored that there's a wires guidance that's out there in development. Whether or not that comes out and when is something that's out there. We talked about the proposed low risk framework that the service conducted a webinar on in December. Again, that hasn't come out as proposed yet, and whether or not we will see it, I think is still a question. And we talked about the litigation settlement from last year where the service expected to propose an amendment to the rulemaking in August 2021. The service had announced an intent to publish an advance notice of proposed rulemaking ahead of those amendments, so kind of a preliminary call for ideas and comments before they actually propose an amendment. We haven't seen that yet. Unclear when or what that will look like whenever we see it, but that's something that's out there. And then finally, the proposed rulemaking in 2021. So that is kind of the foundation of what's going on in the regulatory stage for purposes of the EGLE rule. Now I'm going to turn it over to Chris, who's going to talk more about some more practical aspects of the EGLE permit rule.
First, I think we're going to launch them. Do we have a survey question, Shayna? A poll question?
We do. I thought we were doing those after, but I will launch it right now.
Okay.
All right, you ready, Chris? Here goes your first question. Which of the following is not a purpose of EGLE use surveys? People are slowly responding, but it looks like our top answer, Chris, is C, documenting EGLE nest locations at 41%. Oh, 48%. How do we do, Chris?
I would agree with that one, yes.
Shall we launch the next one or save them till the end?
Let's save the others for the end.
Sounds good.
Okay, do I have control of the slides?
Nope, I will pass those along through the deck if you just let me know when.
Okay, all right, go ahead, please advance. I'm going to talk to you today about how we implement in the field and in interacting with the service a little bit, the process of understanding risk to eagles and entering into the permit process if necessary. And it's important to note up front, I think, that there is a permit process that has been prescribed by regulation for getting a permit for if your project is going to take eagles. And that drives a lot of these survey practices. However, some of them I'm going to present to you are best practices anyway for understanding even whether or not you need to enter into that process. And in some cases, there is a trade-off in costs between starting some of these early or waiting to see if you need them. And that trade-off typically is upfront monetary cost versus lost time on the back end if you do need to enter the permit process. Today, I'll be talking about pre-construction surveys and what are the typical surveys that are conducted, and also a few twists on that vary from project to project. Then I'll also go a little bit into post-construction monitoring, including how we search for eagle carcasses and how we estimate fatalities. And then just a brief discussion of post-construction risk reduction, because the eagle permitting is one of the areas where we see a lot of movement forward on the implementation of technology and other methods of post-construction risk reduction. Next slide, please. So first of all, let's start with the eagle use survey. And for me, every survey we do for a client comes down to the question that we're trying to answer. And so where I wanted to start with eagle use surveys is, why do we do them? And the underlying answers here are a few of the reasons you might want to do eagle use surveys. It's good to know if eagles are present in a wind project area. It's also good to know what their usage rates are like so that you can compare to other projects and make some decisions about what you think relative risk is. It's always good to know about how they're using space if they're present. those are all things that you may want to do regardless of whether you're planning to enter the take permit process or not. Then there's also fatality prediction. In order to get an incidental take permit for eagles, you're going to have data sufficient to produce a fatality prediction using collision risk model that the Fish and Wildlife Service has put out there. In order to do that, you have to meet data requirements that were put forth in the 2016 rule revision. I've listed those down below. Every point that you're surveying will need to be surveyed for 12 hours per survey point per year. You need 2 full years of eagle use surveys to populate the model. You should have at least 30% spatial coverage of the project footprint, and you need to pay attention to what is the 3-dimensional viewshed proportion that you're actually sampling, because that will have to be submitted to the Fish and Wildlife Service as part of a data package to facilitate the fatality modeling. Some of these requirements are less straightforward than they appear. For example, for those of you who are wind developers listening to this webinar, try to imagine over the course of 2 years how many layout changes might occur in a typical wind energy project, and then think about how you're going to maintain survey coverage and get 12 points per survey point per year if the project footprint keeps changing. That's one of the complications that, frankly, consultants and the Fish and Wildlife Service are struggling with a little bit right now. So let's move on to the next slide, please. The rest of the reason why here, that last bit was predicting annual fatality. So I just wanted to show you, this is the only math equation I'm going to show you today. It is the basic collision risk model that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses to predict eagle fatalities. And I just want to focus on the term there that's circled in red, the lambda term, which is the exposure rate. The reason that we're collecting point count survey data in a very specific way for eagles is in order to provide inputs for that exposure rate lambda term. This model uses prior probability information from projects that may or may not resemble the project you're trying to develop at the time. Chances are they probably don't, because most of them were older projects. And then that information is going to be updated by the data that you collect regarding eagle use at the facility. And so because of that, the quality of the data and the quality of the sampling you do is very important. The worse the data quality, or if it doesn't meet the data standards from the 2016 rule, you may end up with a model that's driven entirely by the prior probabilities, which probably aren't representative of your project. The more data and the better data you collect for eagle use at your project, the more the result of this collision risk model should resemble what could happen at your project. And that's subject to the caveat that Brooke already mentioned, is that by design, it's going to overestimate fatalities, because the Fish and Wildlife Service, if they're going to give a take permit, they would like to ensure that you're not going to exceed that take permit. Okay, next slide, please. This is just a little bit of how we do these surveys. So at each eagle use survey point, we are surveying an 800-meter radius and 200-meter high cylinder of air. So I've put an imaginary turbine inside that. The height of that cylinder is designed to move so that it's always 25 meters above the maximum blade tip height. So as turbines get taller, the height of the cylinder of air that we're sampling at each point is increasing. The fatality model, the collision risk model, takes into account the height of that cylinder as it's calculating the exposure rate. What we're going to be doing during that time is we're going to be very carefully tracking the minutes of eagle flight within the cylinder. We're also going to be paying attention to eagles that are flying outside the cylinder. And so what you typically would want to do is record all of the exposure minutes within the cylinders and report those as inputs to the collision risk model, but the movements of the eagles above and outside those cylinders tell you a lot about the spatial distribution of use in your project, so you also want to know about those. The sampling has to be spatially representative for the project, and it also needs to be randomized. So there's an example of a sample layout on a hypothetical project on the left there, and you can see that there are some gaps. There's not a regular arrangement of point count locations in that project. That's driven by two things. First of all, a truly random sample is not going to be very evenly spaced. It's going to tend to have some clumping in it here and there. And secondly, you'll see that there are areas with roads and areas without roads. And what we've done here is what's called balance acceptance sampling. In this case, where we have laid out a grid and we have selected the sites randomly and then rejected the ones that are inaccessible and replaced them with other ones. The three images at the bottom of this slide are just to remind me and remind us all that the conditions that you need to sample in and the locations you need to sample in order to do this sometimes require some creativity, they require endurance, and sometimes they require good judgment regarding what weather conditions are not suitable. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that in order to get the collision risk model run for your project, you're going to need to provide raw eagle use data to the Fish and Wildlife Service. They have put together what they call the EAIT data form template. And this is shown in the screenshot here. It's a standard data form for submitting the raw data, and any project that seeks an incidental take permit is going to be asked to submit data on this form. My point here is just that although this is done in the interest of streamlining from the Fish and Wildlife Service's perspective, we found in practice that populating the form is not a trivial undertaking in terms of either time or expense, and so it needs to be taken into consideration when planning a project Eagle Take permit application. Please go to the next slide. One last thing on eagle use surveys. There is more and more talk these days about machine vision potentially replacing the stalwart biologists in the field with the binoculars. We did here at West have an opportunity to do a little bit of comparison work and reported on it a few years ago at a conference. And you can see here what we compared was a mobile identiflight unit, which is a machine vision and artificial intelligence system that identifies and tracks eagles. We compared that to biologists working in the field, and you can see there that the survey effort that Identiflight was capable of and that any machine is going to be capable of is much higher in a given sampling season. Also, it recorded a lot more eagle minutes. Interestingly, if you look at the ratio of eagle minutes to survey effort, what we found here was that biologists actually overestimate eagle use relative to machine vision. And as a result of that, the annual fatality predictions that came out of a collision risk model run with those data were actually lower for the artificial intelligence machine vision system than they were for biologists. There are a lot of other mitigating factors to think about before you decide that machine vision is the way you want to go here, but did just want to point out that's an option that may be out there and may be increasing in availability to perform eagle use surveys. Okay, next slide, please. Eagle nest surveys. Again, I want to start with why do we do eagle nest surveys? And there are really three primary goals that you generally see for these. The overarching goal is going to be to identify and characterize any breeding pairs of eagles that could potentially be affected by a project development. The subsidiary questions to that are, where are the nests? That's often called inventorying the nests. What is their status? So are they occupied? Are they in use by active breeding? Are they in territories that are being defended by eagles, but there's not breeding in the nests? And then finally, what is their productivity? Typically, for most development projects here that are going into the Eagle Take permitting process, you'll see pre-construction emphasis on the first two questions, a little bit less emphasis on the productivity, and you may see some conditions in a permit relating to ongoing eagle nest monitoring. Just this year, in April 2020, the Fish and Wildlife Service revised its guidance for how to do these surveys. It used to be that the guidance that we worked with was that you should search for them in a 10-mile radius around your project. For some projects, particularly projects in the Western US, this could mean having to survey in excess of 1,000 square miles. So it was a very large undertaking, very expensive in terms of human resources and also aircraft time. So this year, the Fish and Wildlife Service released this new guidance based on telemetry data that they had collected that suggested that a 2-mile radius around a wind project would be sufficient for estimating risk to breeding eagles. And that's based on the observation primarily that 85% of golden eagle movements happen within 2 miles of a nest during the breeding season. So they felt like there's very little likelihood in most cases of eagles being significantly impacted by a wind project beyond that 2-mile radius during breeding season. They also noted there that bald eagle movements are even more constrained than golden eagle movements around the nest, so that setting up a 2-mile survey area for golden eagles should also be sufficient for bald eagles. Next slide, please. There are a variety of methods that are undertaken and some that perhaps can be undertaken in the future but aren't quite there yet. I just wanted to give you a brief rundown of that. Many times surveys are ground-based, and I think we're going to see more ground-based surveys now that the survey areas are decreasing. The diagram there shows a hypothetical wind project. The red outline is the outline of the project footprint, and then around that is a 2-mile radius search area, and I've drawn some transects back and forth across it. Typically, ground-based surveys will be conducted from roadways and other publicly accessible areas, and so surveys there won't follow straight transects. They'll tend to follow roadways. That can provide, in some cases, limited ability to view and detect nests. So our thinking is that in many areas, the probability of detecting nests is a little bit lower for ground-based surveys than it is for aerial surveys. On the plus side, ground-based surveys are certainly ideal if you need to do longer-term monitoring, like we need to make repeated visits to monitor activity at a nest. Aerial surveys give you probably a higher probability of detecting nests, provided that they're done appropriately. They certainly give you a superior view of what's going on inside of a nest. However, they're also dangerous. And there was a recent publication a couple of years ago that indicated 66% of biologist fatalities on the job are due to performing aerial wildlife surveys. So it's definitely non-trivial. And I think probably part of the Fish and Wildlife Service's rationale was in reducing the survey area was also to reduce the danger to biologists performing these surveys. We're seeing a lot of development in the area of drones these days, and a drone does provide a way to get all the benefits of an aerial nest survey without putting people at risk. However, that's not currently accepted as a valid technique by the Fish and Wildlife Service. It's actually considered to be prohibited activity at this point. So there's more research work to be done there, and I think some policy reworking to be done before drones are a viable means of performing these surveys. The only other downside really to drones is that to maintain control of the drone, you have to have line of sight to it. So you won't see drones flying transects over hundreds of square miles. It will probably look a little bit more like a hybrid of a ground-based survey and an aerial survey. And finally, coming to the concept of hybrid surveys, I think we're going to also see increasing emphasis on using hybrid surveys where you cover visible areas by the ground as much as possible, and you use a drone or perhaps a manned aircraft to cover only those areas that really require an aerial survey in order to get views into the nests. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. I mentioned that there are other surveys that kind of vary from project to project. One of those would be surveys of the prey base. If you apply for an incidental take permit for eagles, one of the questions that the Fish and Wildlife Service will ask is, what can you tell us about the prey base in the project area? So that may mean that you're going to be doing surveys of big game distribution, ground squirrels, other prey items, including sources of livestock carrion, which is particularly in the Midwestern US can be very important. Sometimes these might just be mapping exercises. In many states in the West, you can get really good maps of important areas for big game species, and that gives you some idea of what the concentrations are likely to be without going to a more expensive survey-based approach. Also, roost surveys are another survey type that there's increasing emphasis on as more projects enter the incidental take permit process for bald eagles. Bald eagles often form relatively large communal roosts. I think if you look at the image in the lower left on this slide, there are 13 or 14 bald eagles visible in a tree there. It's a typical communal roost. They'll form these in the evening, and then they'll all leave them in the morning to go forage. And so what you end up with is a centralized location that a lot of bald eagles are passing through, and anything near that might be a greater risk than things that are farther away from it. Fortunately, there is a web-based resource that's recently become available out there. I've put the link in red at the bottom of this slide for anyone who wants to check it out. It's not a comprehensive mapping of bald eagle roost, but it does map quite a few known bald eagle roost locations, particularly in the eastern and midwestern US. Finally, at some projects, you may need to also do some surveying for migration concentrations. I usually advise my clients to be pretty hesitant to do these. Most projects don't have features in them that are going to concentrate migration of eagles to any extent, and I think that's largely because those locations have already been avoided. However, if you do have a feature that can concentrate eagle migration, then you should certainly do some concentrated surveys of that. Next slide, please.
Chris, not to interrupt you, but I assume you're going to be wrapping up soon.
Yes.
Awesome.
So I just wanted to cover post-construction monitoring. The most common thing done is fatality monitoring, which it always involves searches of plots. They're generally large plots. It may be done by transects or by visual scans. More commonly, we're seeing visual scans be an acceptable approach, which is great because if you look at the right side of this slide, you can see the time difference between doing a visual scan and doing a transect search of an equivalent plot. There's quite a big time difference. It's much more economical to perform scan surveys for eagles if you can. Along with the scan surveys, though, you're going to need to have a really good idea of how searchable those plots are from your centralized location. And that's what this image of vegetative cover shows in the bottom of the slide. Next slide, please. Finally, just talking about fatality estimation and how that fits into compliance monitoring. The problem that we're going to have is that eagle fatalities are rare events. And so if we find 0 fatalities, that could mean there were 0 fatalities. But because we're dealing with a federal permit, that may not be enough, just assuming that what we searched is representative. So we need to do a little bit more thinking about it, because it could also mean that we just didn't search enough. There is a tool called evidence of absence for estimating the probability of fatalities given how much effort you undertook. And the real key there is this thing called G, which is the site-wide probability of detection. Next slide. And so the G really incorporates everything about searches for eagle fatalities. It incorporates the proportion of turbines that are searched, the carcass persistence, or how long carcasses are staying before they're being scavenged, The average probability that a carcass falls into the search area, that comes into play in what's called an area correction. And also it takes account of searcher efficiency, which is how good the searchers are at actually finding carcasses. In this particular example I threw together, depending on some of these assumptions, we get a G from 0.5 to 0.8. In reality, in the field, we're finding that getting G to be greater than 0.25 is difficult. And that's important because the Fish and Wildlife Service is typically attaching a target G to eagle take permit conditions to ensure that compliance is truly being well monitored. And so that's, I think, an ongoing and growing challenge in the field. And I think in the interest of time, I'll skip over the risk reduction because I think that's going to be covered in a subsequent seminar also. I guess we could do this last slide. Here's just a quick comparison of different survey methods. Scan surveys are cheaper. Transect surveys are going to be a little more expensive. There are some areas where detection dogs might be the way to go, but the cost is highly variable there, and there are logistical complications associated with dogs that need to be thought out. Dogs are great searchers, but they're not great workers. They fatigue after about 4 hours. So where you might need 2 humans, you might need 4 dogs to get the same job done. You also have a lot of difficulty housing and caring for dogs that you don't have with field technicians. And then I think also there are opportunities for hybrid surveys, but I do want to say that with the Fish and Wildlife Service putting out its own monitoring protocol for fatalities, we may see a lot of these possibilities faded away if that becomes finalized and becomes a rule. That's it. I'm going to leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you, Chris. I think we'll
next up. Oh, do you want to do the?
Oh, should we just launch it super quick? We'll do, how about one of the two? Because we already teased it to the audience.
Sure.
I'll launch your next question. All right, according to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service 2020 Eagle Nest Survey Protocol Update, and then pick what you think is the correct answer. Wow, okay, well, 100% of people have voted for D. Chris, how did we do?
They're right, and that's an important one to know, I think.
Awesome, well, thank you so much, Chris. I think we'll start with Laura now.
All right, thank you.
Okay. Do I need to share my webcam, or are you guys doing that?
You would need to share your webcam from your screen if you would like to, but it's optional.
Okay. Okay, next slide, please. So I'm going to go a little bit at East Coast speed here because I know that they want to have some time for questions. And so I was asked to give the industry perspective, and I think in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is talk a little bit about what we know about eagles and wind. And the best source of information comes from Brian Millsap, and he has a bunch of golden eagles that had GPS telemetry units on them so that we have unbiased information on where the fatalities are coming from. And if we look at the anthropogenic fatalities, what you'll see is that shooting, electrocution, poisoning are really the dominant forms of ways that eagle die. Collisions, often collisions with overhead lines or cars is one of them, fences, trapping, and lead. And in the document that they wrote up, you actually can't pick wind out because they put wind in under collision, but there are about 2 fatalities. So when you look at the anthropogenic causes of fatalities of golden eagles, it's fairly low. In contrast, if you look at the eagle permits issued to date, there have been 17 permits issued for wind projects, 1 permit issued for a solar project, and I think there might be a mining one out there as well. Next slide, please. So from the industry perspective, one of the things that I have to do that makes this all challenging is that I have to go to the board to get approval for these. And that's because the cost of these starts out easily over $1 million and goes up from there, depending on the length of time of the permit and the number and type of eagles that you have. And the challenge that I have is, although Fish and Wildlife is under the hopeful idea that your costs and effort are going to be reduced over time, the board needs to evaluate this based on the worst case scenario, because that's what the company is committing to. What that means is we have to do it based on the number of eagles predicted in the collision risk model, which we know is a purposeful overestimate. We have to assume that all the adaptive management is being implemented and that the maximum amount of curtailment will be in place. And because of that, it really dramatically increases the company's perspective on what these permits could look like and what the commitments are. Similarly, one of the challenges too is because these permits don't have a timeline associated with them, and it often takes years to get through the process. It's hard to evaluate what the repercussions of that are, because the financial implications to the project are relative to the years of spend. So there's a lot of money spent on a wind facility up front, and then it tapers over time. So where in that process your big spends come, it matters. So another piece here is that our operating budgets are due in June. And June and January are worlds different from each other often. And so I often have millions of dollars of budget in that are put into the budget each year for eagle permits. And because of that, my company doesn't think I know what's going on, because for years and years and years, I keep putting millions of dollars in, and we keep not successfully moving to that point of spending it. So it creates some uncertainty there. Similarly, in the 5-year review, actions are unclear. And what happens there is, because we don't know what happens in that 5-year review, the Fish and Wildlife Service could add additional permit conditions. And so again, it's a hard thing to tell your board, hey, we're getting this permit, but the Fish and Wildlife could change it over time. And finally, wind uses the metric that we use to sell power is called the power purchase agreement. And it's a fixed level over a certain number of years. And what that does is over time, it makes it hard to accommodate for changes, like changes in regulations and changes in permits, compared to a lot of utilities where they're rate-based. So when they have changes in their operating, they carry that over to their customers, and we don't have that option to do that. Now, one of the solutions that we have as an industry that we have mulled over is the possibility of a general permit program. And I'm going to talk more about that later. Next slide, please. Okay, there's a couple other places where the permit program comes into play. The first is tax equity. So tax equity is when companies buy into the projects to get the tax benefits. And when a company does this, because they're buying into the company, they do full due diligence on the project, and they review all of the work that you've done and all the permits that you have or don't have. And so a tax equity company may have an opinion about whether you have a permit or not, or may even want you to get it in a certain amount of time, which is a big challenge. Similarly, a lot of projects are sold, or a partial sale of the project happens. And again, then you're working with other companies who may have opinions about whether you should or shouldn't have a permit. And one of the places that, when you're not from the industry, people tend not to realize is that sometimes your power purchase agreement, it may have minimums of power that you need to produce. And if you have long-term curtailments or other things that are impacting your power production, you could actually be violating your power purchase agreement. Similarly, we end up in conflicts when there are regional power emergencies. And you hear about this in the news a fair bit in California with the blackouts and brownouts that occur particularly in Southern California. And when these energy emergencies occur, there are penalties for curtailing your turbines during these emergencies. So essentially, you've got different federal laws warring with each other. Next slide, please. So one of the challenges once you get the permit issued is how you're going to do fatality monitoring. And Chris touched on this briefly. And fatality monitoring is required to demonstrate compliance with take authorization limits. So the challenge is Fish and Wildlife has implied a really high level of precision, which requires a high level of effort. And Chris talked a little bit about searches and searcher frequency and carcass persistence trials, all of which kind of tie into our fatality estimate. So in theory, we could have a lower level precision, but the problem is that puts us at risk of exceeding the authorized take limit. And that's because evidence of absence is not based on eagles found, it's based on estimated eagles. So it's possible to find no eagles and have a really high estimate of eagles. And that's another thing that's really hard to explain to management, that we're mitigating for things that we didn't actually find. So ironically, the lower the take level, the harder it is to prove that you are in compliance with your take authorization. So you can actually spend more money monitoring for a well-sited project that has low eagle risk than you would for a project that has anticipated higher eagle risk, which is a little ironic. And again, we think a general permit program, we've got some ideas, currently doesn't exist, but we have some solutions that we might be able to do through pooling data that could help solve some of these problems. So as Chris mentioned, there's different methods, but in general, it's easier when you are in these open areas with limited vegetation. And luckily on the eagle side of the house, we have larger carcass sizes, which helps a lot, easier to find, and they have higher carcass persistence than smaller things like that. The challenge though is a lot of wind facilities are in areas that are heavily agriculture, as encouraged by the wind energy guidelines. But it's really hard to search for dead things when you're in corn or soybeans or something that grows in thick. Next slide, please. So these all interplay with each other. So as your eagle take limit increases, your mitigation costs increase for golden eagles for sure, and possibly for balds, depending on the level. Your public perception issue increases. And what we didn't get a chance to get into is that the collision risk model as it's currently used is based on golden eagles and isn't bald eagle specific. So what happens there is you often end up with estimates of bald eagles that are in the double digits per year. So you could imagine that a collision risk model might say that you're going to have 50 dead bald eagles over the course of 5 years, which practically is not supported by any of the data that are out there. But understandably, the general public, when looking at this, could be concerned about that because that's the number that you're presenting. The flip side of all of this, as I mentioned earlier, is that the higher your take limit is, the lower your monitoring costs. So the better sited your project, the higher your monitoring costs, and the more eagles in the area, the lower your monitoring costs. Next slide, please. Okay, so assuming we've got our permit in hand, that's awesome. We're going to go mitigate. Great, check that box. And the challenge is we have a couple of different options and they're all hard for different reasons. So the first is we might want to work with a company that has an avian protection plan to retrofit higher risk poles. Awesome. Well, remember before I said that the timing is uncertain. When you're working with other companies, they might be wanting to do other things on those lines when you're out there fixing them. And so trying to align budgets and timing is really hard. As Brooke mentioned, you can't retrofit anything and have a count that was in the plan. So ironically, only the companies themselves are allowed to retrofit the high-risk poles. That's what's in their plan, and we get the leftovers. So we actually may not be retrofitting high-risk poles. Fish and Wildlife sometimes has strong opinions about what poles are used, so you have to bring them into the conversation, which can differ from the opinion of utility companies. And there's often additional monitoring, and depending on the level of the utility company, they may or may not want to participate because of that monitoring. Flip side of that is you could buy into an in-lieu fee program. They've already taken care of all these other things, but it's a lot more expensive. Or you could develop your own mitigation plan, like a roadside carcass removal. As I mentioned before, eagles get hit when they're on the side of the road. So if you get the carcasses out of the way, they get hit less. But the Fish and Wildlife requires a fair bit of information in order for those other mitigation options to carry. And to date, none decide power pole retrofits have been included in an ACP. Next slide, please. Okay, so what is the industry doing about eagles? We're doing a lot, supporting research. I wanted to put this up so everybody could see all the choices, but essentially through supporting Department of Energy, providing host sites, and providing funds,
the wind industry is provided for a bunch of different avoidance, minimization, and otherwise understanding what eagles are doing and how to make the execution of the eagle permits work better. Next slide. Okay, so we've also tested a lot of technology. The pros of the technology, it's super cool. And it potentially allows for the expansion of where projects go and management of existing projects that have challenges. The downside is a lot of these companies that are developing the technologies are small companies. And what that means is if something goes wrong and they go out of business, you're in trouble. And we had that happen with a automated lighting system, and we installed it in a project and the company went out of business. So my company is very sensitive to that. A lot of these technologies haven't been scaled up from testing to full project development, so there's some complications there. They're all too new for us to understand the replacement rates and maintenance costs, and Fish and Wildlife doesn't know how to include those benefits when you're doing your collision risk models. Next slide. So like I mentioned before, the industry's been talking about this, and we think a general permit program is going to be the solution. The industry hopes that the new revision will include this, and the idea is it'll cover projects with low eagle risk, which really is most projects. It'll be easy and straightforward, clear criteria for entry, monitoring commensurate with risk, and this should be a win-win-win because the general permit should make it easier to move through the process, which means more projects will participate, which means we have more conservation for eagles. Next slide. So in sum, a general permit would really be useful for the current challenges that we're facing. Uncertainty on permit timing and permit terms and conservative assumptions collectively make it hard to implement these permits. And technology may provide some solutions for some projects, but there's still challenges in scaling up and figuring out how everything works. So short version on the industry perspective.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was excellent. And I appreciate that you're from the East Coast and your East Coast timing, even if you do live outside of Portland now. So I ask all of our speakers if they will put on their webcam or at least be ready to answer some questions. And I really hope that the audience's questions start coming in. We're going to start with some survey questions that have been posed to Chris. Chris, can you provide a bit more detail about the difference between visual scans and transect surveys?
For post-construction, yes, I didn't have much time to go into that. So at a visual scan, the way that's typically done is the searcher will go to a turbine base and they will make a scan out to a predetermined distance. We normally use around 100 to 120 meters, depending on the turbine size, in each of the 4 cardinal directions, and they'll search as thoroughly as they can that entire quadrant each time and then move on to the next one. Then they'll also make a search of the road on their way in and out. So this facilitates, it takes 10 or 15 minutes per turbine. Usually it facilitates being able to get to all the turbines, so you get really good spatial coverage and representativeness of your wind farm that way. In a transect survey, and this is the more typical search that's been done for fatality monitoring for a long time, searchers are walking fixed transects back and forth across a plot, and they're usually at fairly tight spacing, anywhere from 5 to 10 or 15 meters apart, depending on the species that they're searching for. They're walking and they're scanning on either side of them as they walk slowly, searching for carcasses. So you're probably more likely to detect an eagle carcass in some cover types that way than you are through a scan. However, the way fatality estimation is done, we're able to account for all of those potential sources of bias that come into play. And so I think what it comes down to when planning searches for eagle carcasses is what's practicable for a particular project and what gives you the best monitoring for that project. As Laura mentioned, a lot of times the financial ability of an operating project is limited, And so they can often get a lot more monitoring done using a scan approach than they can using a transect approach.
Thanks, Chris. And Laura, I was going to ask you to opine as well. I know you've done some research on the scan versus transect survey. So can you talk a little bit about that from a developer's perspective on when you might use one or the other?
Yeah, we were actually, Jerry Ruppy on my team was instrumental in developing this method. And the idea was we could use it with the operations staff to try to manage costs. And interestingly enough, the operations staff were as effective as the biologists. They did a great job in looking for stuff. But unfortunately, in how Fish and Wildlife wrote the rule, because it has to be a third party, we're no longer able to leverage that, which is too bad. But for our projects, we really try to focus the scanning searches on areas where we have good visibility. So areas out west or in the desert, more deserty areas where you can see a long way and then it's effective. So anytime you're in corn or something like that, your ability to scan isn't very good during the growing season. However, after the corn is cut and through the winter, scanning searches might be a great option. So we often end up mixing and matching to make sure that we get the best coverage that we can with the site for the minimal cost to kind of try to find that optimal balance.
Thank you, Laura. And then I'll go one more quick survey question and then we'll move on to others. Chris, what are your thoughts on a hybrid survey using ground searchers with limited drone use?
I think particularly given the new smaller search areas that could be highly effective. I think there's still some work needs to be done figuring it out. But so far, what we've learned about drones from the research world is that some species of raptors are more defensive in response to drones than others around the nest. And eagles, and particularly bald eagles, seem to fall on the lower end of responsiveness. So it's probably going to be a useful way to do surveys, particularly in areas where in the East and Midwest, where we have smaller project footprints and much more difficult vegetation cover to search. I think probably ground searches alone are not going to be fully sufficient. We're going to need to come up with a drone-based solution there.
Fascinating, especially with the drone versus raptor interaction component. Thank you. So now we're going to move from monitoring to compensatory mitigation. Laura, you talked a little bit about the challenges of that from a financing perspective, but the audience is wondering, how is the mitigation cost structured and when is it required to be paid?
So the payment is still a little unclear. We're hearing now that the Fish and Wildlife wants the first 2 years of payment up front, and after that they're a little bit flexible, but the Fish and Wildlife offices are variable in their approach, and some are looking for full up front, so it all depends. And then we work with whatever organizations we're working for to develop what those costs will be in terms of both the cost of retrofitting the poles and any sort of management cost that would be associated with that.
Thank you. And I think this next question, now we're going into estimating risk pre-construction, and this can be there for Chris and Laura. Does the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service publish priors? Laura, you may have to explain what priors are. And does the wind industry know what specific data goes into the prior?
You want to start with that one, Laura? Or you want me to?
I'll start. So the Fish and Wildlife does publish the priors. We do not have the actual data that went into them. So we know what we're getting into. And for those who aren't in the weeds on this, essentially priors are associated with something called Bayesian statistics. And what priors say is before you go into a situation, you often know something about it. So it says, we know what eagles do generically, and then we collect information from your project, and then we mush together the two pieces of information, the prior and your project-specific information, to get an answer. So the more data you collect for your project, the more that takes over and really drives the answer. But if you don't have data for a project, like for an older project that went in before these rules were in place and these analyses were in place, you wouldn't have data, so everything would be driven by what the priors were. And those are based on projects in California with older generation technologies. Chris, what did I miss?
Well, as by way of an update, what we're seeing from the Fish and Wildlife Service now on the modeling is if you have a project that is applying for a permit subsequent to the 2016 rule, and you don't have 2 complete years of data, they're showing a tendency to throw out your data completely and use what's called a priors only model. So this is a real hazard, I think, for wind developers at this point who have almost 2 years, but not quite 2 years, in that they've invested quite a bit in collecting site-specific data that can refine that estimate, but it's not getting used. And so I think that really puts a premium on thinking hard about the timing and the amount of effort that goes into your Eagle use surveys.
And I'd like to add a counterpoint to that, because there seems to be a perspective that we have complete control over project schedules, and we don't. Sometimes the schedule is driven by the off-taker and when they need the power. Sometimes the schedule is driven by the turbine manufacturers and when they can deliver the turbines. And sometimes it's other outside forces. And sometimes we have total control, which is almost never the case, but sometimes it does happen. So we don't often have the option of saying, oh no, we'll push back construction, because right now too, with the end of the production tax credit, all the construction companies are super busy, and so we can't say, oh, we're going to delay construction for 2 months to get our full 2 years of data so that we can use that, because of the, if we lose the construction company, then we can't build the project for another 2 years. And so there's a lot of forces in play in terms of the timing of the development of when a project is actually constructed, and a lot of them are out of our hands.
And I'll just add, this is the problem I've seen the most frequently recently, because trying to explain both, whether it's to Laura's management or to a tax equity investor, that, well, yeah, we did the avian use survey, we ran the collision risk model, but it's not using the site-specific data, it's using the generic priors. So these really big numbers you're seeing are probably not reflective of the risk here or the cost here, but that's what we have to go on for right now. And making that case to all the different parties that are evaluating a project becomes it becomes challenging.
So Brooke, I'm just going to ask you to opine, and we have just 30 seconds left. Can you talk about quickly all of the different people you would have to make that convincing to? Because it's not just the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
Yeah, so within your own company, it's looking at your data and deciding how to manage the project, right? Assessing what your risk is of both enforcement and whether or not it makes sense to go for a permit, and then all the different pieces that come into play, into discussing that with your project team and management and whatnot. Because a lot of times, even though you could have very low, for instance, Laura talked about some of the problems with the collision risk model and bald eagle. And you could have very low bald eagle use, but because of the way that model works, it's still going to put you in a collision risk model result that makes it look like you have some bald eagle risk. And that, depending on familiarity with that collision risk model, they're like, oh, you have to get a permit, there's eagle risk here, where that may not actually be the case, and is more a function of the model. And so you have all of that internal dialogue of protecting yourself from enforcement, but also maintaining your own environmental stewardship policies, right? Like, you don't want to be someone that's, willy-nilly predicting take of eagles and not going for a permit necessarily, depending on how a company feels about it and their sophistication of the models. And then when they have tax equity investors looking at that, explaining to them that decision-making process and why these numbers may not actually be representative of risk, and what, and how, coordination with the service may help affect that enforcement risk, and those sorts of considerations all have to be explained to basically anyone involved with making decisions related to that project.
Thanks, Brooke. Yeah, it's pretty complex. Thanks for summarizing that. And with that, we will conclude our 5th webinar. Thanks, Shana. Don't forget, we still have 4 more to go, and we'll get webinar 6 out there for y'all to see quickly. And I want to thank our 3 panelists so much for joining us and spending so much time sharing their expertise. So thanks all.
Ira.
Thanks, guys.